The Riverbend had always been the loudest place for miles, a wide curve of slow, brown water moving around a bed of smooth stones, the sound of its current rolling like distant thunder. Locals said you could hear it even in your sleep, a steady reminder that life in the valley depended on water and the patience of those who lived beside it. But on that early autumn morning, the river was quiet. A thin mist lay across the surface, pale as breath against a window pane. The sky above it was soft gray, streaked with faint hints of amber where the sun was trying to rise. Dew clung to the tall prairie grasses, bending them under its weight. Somewhere in the distance, a bird cried, one lonely call, quickly swallowed by the stillness. Then came the buffalo. He emerged from the low fog, like a drifting island of muscle and fur, his heavy steps muffled by the damp ground. His coat was dark, shaking with the slow flex of his movements, and his breath rose in thick white puffs. He didn't hurry. Buffalo never did unless they had reason. He walked with the gravity of something ancient and certain, each step deliberate in the cold morning light. From the opposite bank, Elias Turner watched him. Elias stood knee-deep in reeds, a fishing pole forgotten in his hands. He was a man who had lived beside this river all his life, a rancher's son, a rancher himself now, with shoulders built from labor and hands shaped by years of rope, saddle, and soil. He had seen buffalo before, plenty, but never like this. The animal paused at the water's edge, lowering his head. The surface of the river rippled softly where his breath touched it, but the current didn't pull the ripples away. They simply spread, hesitated, and then faded in place, as if the water no longer knew how to move. Elias blinked. "That's not right," he muttered. The buffalo stepped forward. His hooves sank slightly, breaking through the thin layer of wet mud. Then, with a low grunt, he began crossing the river. Water parted around him, clinging to his fur, but it did not flow behind him the way it should have. Usually a buffalo's crossing sent waves rolling downstream, disturbing the whole bend. Today, the river remained eerily calm. The water didn't rush back into his footprints. It didn't swirl. It didn't follow. Elias felt a pinch of cold crawl up his spine. He stepped closer without thinking, boots landing softly in the wet grass. He wasn't afraid, not of the animal at least. Buffalo were powerful, unpredictable creatures, but Elias knew their body language better than most. No, the unease came from something else. Something in the air. Something in the silence. When the buffalo reached the center of the river, the mist thickened around him, turning his massive form into a moving shadow. For a moment, he disappeared completely. Elias held his breath. Then the buffalo stepped out of the fog onto the far bank, water streaming off his body in long beads. But when his hooves left the riverbed, the impressions they had made did not fill. They remained behind, deep, unmoving hollows in the water itself, as if the river were made of something thicker than liquid, something unsure of its own nature. "Jesus," Elias whispered. The buffalo climbed the bank, shook himself once, and walked into the prairie beyond. No rush, no hesitation. The grass bent beneath him and swayed back again, the only movement in the entire landscape. Elias stared at the riverbend, at the water that refused to flow, at the surface that lay still as glass. The world around him held its breath. He found himself whispering, "What happened to you?" But the river offered no answer. It only waited, silent and heavy, as though it had witnessed something it did not know how to forget. Elias spent most of the morning standing on the riverbank, staring at a river that refused to behave like one. The mist slowly lifted, rising in pale ribbons toward the warming sky, but the bend remained unnaturally still, not frozen. No, the water still moved if he disturbed it with a stick or stone, but it did not flow. It simply sank, spread, and settled, as though the river had forgotten its own direction. By the time the sun pushed through the clouds, Elias finally left the reeds and walked back toward his truck, boots soaked to the ankle. The gravel popped beneath his steps, the sound oddly harsh after the oppressive quiet by the water. He climbed into the old pickup, started the engine, and listened to it rumble, a comforting, familiar noise. The river's silence clung to him, though, like a chill he couldn't shake. He needed to tell someone. The drive back to town took 15 minutes along a dusty road lined with cottonwoods and fence posts. Fields stretched wide on either side, dotted with cattle and the occasional coyote slipping through tall grass. Normally, Elias felt at ease here. This was home, simple and predictable. But today everything seemed too ordinary, like a painting of a place he trusted rather than the place itself. He pulled into the yard of the Turner Ranch. The house was old but sturdy, built by his grandfather with timber hauled from the northern valley. His mother, Ruth, stood on the porch, winding a hose, her gray hair gathered into a careful braid. She looked up as he approached. "You're back early," she said. "Catch anything?" Elias hesitated. "Didn't stay long." Ruth paused. "You look pale. Something happened down at the bend?" "Ma, the river's acting strange." She gave a short laugh. "Strange how? Water level low again?" "No, not that." He ran a hand through his hair. "It isn't flowing." Ruth froze. "No, what do you mean, not flowing?" "I mean, it just sits there, like a pond. No current. And I saw a buffalo crossing, big one. But the water didn't move behind him. His wake didn't go downstream. It just stayed where it was." Ruth's face tightened. "Maybe you're tired. You've been working late every night." "No, Ma. I know what I saw." She sighed, setting the hose aside. "Elias, the river's been unpredictable for years. Ever since that drought. Sometimes it flows hard, sometimes barely at all." "Not like this," he said firmly. "Never like this." Ruth didn't argue further, but her silence was worse than disbelief. She'd lived near the river her whole life. She knew its moods better than most. If she didn't have an explanation, that meant she was worried too. They ate lunch at the kitchen table in a quiet that felt fragile. Ruth tried to talk about the neighbor's sick cattle, about the repairs needed on the barn roof, but Elias barely heard her. His mind kept returning to the stillness of the water, to the deep impressions left in its surface where the buffalo had stepped, as though the river had become something thick and heavy, unable to rise and fall like it always had. After lunch, he grabbed his keys. Ruth watched him with knitted brows. "You're going back, aren't you?" "I need to check it again," he said. "Take Jonas with you," she insisted. "If something's wrong, you shouldn't be there alone." He shook his head. "I'll be fine." Ruth stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "If the river's stopped, something's very wrong, Elias? Nature doesn't just forget itself." He met her eyes. "That's exactly why I need to go." The drive back felt longer than before. When he reached the bend, the afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the grass, and for a moment he wondered if he'd imagined everything. Maybe he had been tired. Maybe the early morning fog had played tricks on his mind. But then he stepped out of the truck and heard it. Nothing. No water, no current, no familiar low thunder of flow against stone. The riverbend was as still as a sheet of metal. Elias walked down the bank slowly, feeling a pull in his gut that tightened with every step. When he reached the water's edge, his breath caught. The impressions were still there. Deep, unmoving hollows left behind by the buffalo's hooves. The water inside them was darker than the rest of the bend, motionless, as if holding the exact shape the animal had carved hours earlier. Elias crouched, touched the surface with his fingertips. The water trembled, but it did not move away. It settled again, still and heavy. Behind him, a twig snapped. He turned sharply, scanning the trees. Nothing was there. No animal, no person, no buffalo. Only the faint rustle of wind through the cottonwoods. But something about the sound felt new, like the land was waking up uncertain, confused by its own quiet. Elias stood slowly, eyes fixed on the river. "The water didn't follow," he whispered to himself, repeating the idea that had been circling his mind since dawn. And somewhere deep beneath the still surface of the bend, he felt, rather than heard, a pulse. Not a sound, not a vibration, a presence, waiting, watching. And Elias suddenly understood. The buffalo hadn't simply crossed the river. It had crossed out of something, and the river had stayed behind. By the time evening settled over the valley, the riverbend had grown more unsettling than ever. The stillness no longer felt like simple quiet. It felt like a held breath, stretched thin over something deeper, heavier, and waiting to be released. Elias stayed longer than he meant to, pacing the bank, checking the water from different angles, testing it with sticks, with stones, with his own hands. Every experiment brought the same result. The river responded, but it did not flow. It behaved like a creature that remembered movement only in fragments. As the shadows lengthened, Elias finally walked back to his truck. He was halfway to the door when he saw dust rising from the road, a second vehicle approaching fast. He stepped aside as a familiar pickup pulled in beside his. It was Sheriff Martha Caldwell, a tall woman with sharp blue eyes and the calm demeanor of someone who had seen the worst parts of people and still believed the world could be simple. She killed the engine, stepped out, and looked straight at him. "Your mother called," she said. "Said you found something strange down here." Elias crossed his arms. "I didn't ask her to. She worries. You know that." Martha adjusted her hat. "Mind showing me what you saw?" He hesitated, not because he doubted himself, but because explaining the impossible felt embarrassing. Still, he nodded and led her to the river's edge. The first thing Martha noticed was the silence. Her posture stiffened. "Where's the flow?" "There isn't any." "That's not—" She stopped herself and crouched down. Her eyes swept the bend with professional scrutiny. "Elias, this is a major feeder branch. If the current's gone, something upstream must be blocked." "Doesn't look blocked." Martha reached out and touched the surface with her fingertips. Her brow tightened. "It isn't right. It's like the water's thick." "Like it's staying where it wants to," Elias said quietly. She looked up at him, not dismissive now, but concerned. "What else did you see?" He gestured to the middle of the bend. "A buffalo crossed this morning. Big bull. Left marks in the water that never filled back in." Martha frowned. "Buffalo don't cross alone. This one did." "You sure it wasn't some cattle from the eastern ranch?" "Positive." Martha pushed to her feet, hands on her hips. "All right, show me the marks." They walked along the shore until they reached the dark impressions. Even in the fading light, they were unmistakable. 4 large depressions in the water, suspended like shapes carved into glass. Martha crouched again, her face inches from the surface. "What in God's name?" she murmured. Elias knelt beside her. "I told you. The water hasn't moved at all. Not a ripple." Martha studied the prints with growing unease. "Elias, I've seen droughts, I've seen flash floods, I've seen ice jams. But this," she shook her head, "water doesn't stop like this. Not unless—" She didn't finish the sentence. A low rustle came from the opposite bank. Both of them turned sharply. The tree line across the bend swayed lightly in a wind Elias couldn't feel on his own skin. The branches moved with subtle tension, as though something had passed through moments before. The silence that followed felt heavy, thick enough to swallow their breathing. Then they heard it. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. A drip. Just one. Followed by another, and another. Not from rain, not from a stream, but from somewhere deeper in the river, like a slow heartbeat tapping against the stillness. Martha straightened. "What is that?" Elias listened closely. The sound was irregular, but growing steadier, stronger. Droplets falling in a place where nothing should be falling. "It's coming from under the surface," he said. Martha backed away from the edge. "I don't like that. We should call the water board, maybe the environmental office." "They won't understand," Elias said quietly. "They'll come with charts and probes and tell us the sediment shifted or the ground froze wrong. But this isn't natural, Martha. The buffalo knew something. It crossed like it was leaving this place behind." The sheriff looked at him hard. "And you think something followed it?" "No," Elias said, eyes fixed on the unmoving water. "I think something was released when it crossed." The dripping suddenly stopped. A silence so pure and sudden fell over them that both froze in place. Then, with no warning, a single ripple formed in the center of the riverbend. Just one. Perfect and circular. It expanded outward, and then stopped halfway across the surface, frozen mid-spread like a photograph. Martha exhaled shakily. That's impossible. Elias felt cold crawl up his spine. It's learning how to move again. Elias! She grabbed his sleeve. We need to leave. Right now. He didn't argue. As they hurried to the trucks, Elias looked back once, just once. A dark shape stood at the edge of the tree line across the river. Massive. Still. Watching. Buffalo? Shadow? Or something that didn't have a name yet? He blinked, and it was gone. The sun slipped behind the hills, and the riverbend lay still and breathless under the weight of gathering twilight. Something was waking, and the water was waiting for it. Night settled over the valley like a slow curtain, thick and uneven. The crickets didn't sing. The owls didn't call. Even the wind seemed reluctant to move. By the time Elias returned home, the quiet from the riverbend had followed him like a shadow. He tried to tell himself it was just nerves, just a strange day, just a weird trick of nature. But the silence around the house felt heavier than usual, as though the stillness from the river had crept up the hills and taken hold of the land itself. Ruth was waiting on the porch, her arms crossed against the chill. You were gone too long, she said sharply. Martha called, said something's wrong with the water. Elias kicked mud off his boots. It's not just the water. Ruth's expression shifted. The older she got, the more her instincts resembled the land she lived on. Subtle, alert, sharp, in ways she couldn't always explain. What else? She asked. Elias hesitated. He didn't want to frighten her, but the truth had its own weight. I saw something in the trees, he said quietly. Across the bend. Could have been the buffalo. Could have been something else. Ruth didn't speak for a long moment. Instead, she looked past him, toward the dark fields. Whatever you saw, she said finally. The land's been uneasy all day. Animals won't settle. Even the horses are restless. Elias frowned. Horses? Ruth nodded toward the barn. They're pacing in their stalls. They can sense when the ground's wrong. That cold weight in Elias's stomach tightened. Animals were honest witnesses. They reacted before humans understood the danger. Try to sleep, Ruth said softly. Tomorrow we'll talk to the others. Maybe the river upstream shifted its banks. But neither of them believed that. Elias didn't sleep. The night stretched on, silent and tense. Every so often he would stand at the window, staring toward the valley below. No lights moved, no coyotes howled. The entire countryside held itself still, as if waiting for something to begin, or something to end. Shortly before dawn, he heard a sound. Not in the house, not in the barn. From outside, a soft, distant splash. Elias stiffened. It wasn't possible. The riverbend wasn't close enough for him to hear anything from it. Not unless something very large had entered the water, or something very heavy had stepped out of it. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside. The air was sharp, colorless. Frost clung to the fence rails, and the grass crackled beneath his boots. Nothing moved except a faint wisp of fog curling along the lower fields. Then, another splash. Closer this time. Heavy. Slow. Final. Elias walked quickly down the slope toward the noise, heart pounding harder with each step. He didn't bother waking Jonas or Ruth. Something told him this moment wasn't meant for many eyes. When he reached the bottom of the hill, he saw it. Not the buffalo. Not any creature he recognized. At the far edge of the field, near the irrigation ditch, the soil had cracked open in a long, wet line. Water pooled in the crevice, dark, thick, unmoving, as if the riverbend had begun seeping outward into the land. The earth around the crack glistened like it had been soaked by rain, but the sky above had been clear for days. Elias knelt. The water didn't smell like river water. It didn't smell like anything. He touched the surface. It trembled, but didn't ripple outward. It only pushed inward, as if absorbing the movement rather than reacting to it. He jerked his hand back. Behind him, something exhaled. Elias spun around, breath caught in his throat. A shape stood at the edge of the fog, Massive, hunched, still. Not a buffalo, too tall, too narrow in the shoulders. But something in its stance felt familiar, like the echo of a creature that should have been extinct or forgotten. "Who's there?" Elias called out, though his voice shook. The shape didn't move. Fog drifted past it, revealing and hiding different parts of its silhouette, the slope of its back, the suggestion of legs thicker than fence posts, the faint glint of eyes reflecting dawn light. Then it stepped backward into the fog, not fleeing, not afraid, just withdrawing, as if Elias had arrived before it was ready to be seen. Elias's chest tightened. He stood rooted to the spot until the fog thinned and the shape was gone. He returned to the house at sunrise, shaken, muddy, and pale. Ruth met him at the door, fear already on her face. "What did you see?" she asked. He opened his mouth, then closed it, shaking his head slowly. "It's not just the river that isn't moving anymore," he whispered. "It's the land. And something is walking because of it." Ruth stepped back, hand over her mouth. "What do you mean?" Elias looked out the window toward the distant Riverbend, which shimmered under the pale morning light like a sheet of metal. "I think," Elias said, voice hollow, "the water stopped flowing because something came through that needed the world to be still."